Hi, everyone, and welcome. Dominic here with Catholic Author. Today we're joined by Rhonda Ortiz. Rhonda, it is good to have you with us. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Rhonda is a Lay Dominican, a novelist, nonfiction writer, and a founding editor of Chrism Press. Her debut novel, In Pieces, was the winner of the Crown Award and Competitive Genesis Award. She's a native Oregonian. She attended St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. She now lives in Michigan with her husband and children. So thanks again for coming on. We're going to chat all about you and your background and how all of that plays together. So I think it'll be a fun chat. Very briefly, Silhouettes of the Truth. It's the name of this show. It's about fiction for modern Catholic authors. We talk creed, craft, and co-creation rooted in grit, grace, gods, and sometimes dragons. I'm your host, Dominic D'Souza, novel lover, all-around creative, founder of Catholic Author. We're here to inspire your faith and your fiction. Rhonda, diving right in, what is your backstory? How did you get to where you are today?
My backstory. Well, I was born on a. Just kidding. I am.
A galaxy far, far away. Right?
That's right. I would. I don't. I'm not a spec. I don't write sci-fi or fantasy. I'm a realist. I write realism. So born on a galaxy far, far away is definitely a stretch for me. No, I'm just. I am. I have been writing or publishing since my high school newspaper days. Yes, I was the editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. But I began writing fiction after the birth of our oldest. He's 11 now. And I had an idea for a story that really surprised me because I had never written fiction before. And I think I had the good grace to know that that was going to be a really hard process, that I didn't know how to write fiction. Right away, I knew I don't know how to do this. And so I spent the next several years studying craft and filling my desk drawer with manuscript drafts. My husband calls this period of time my doctoral work. I'm married to an academic, so it's so he likes to joke about that being that time. And then eventually I hit on the idea for the Molly Chase series, which is my current work in progress. The first book was the first novel in the series, was released by Chrism Press this past October. And so that is kind of the story, the genesis of the author story. If you want personal stuff, I'm sure I can go there too.
Well, I'm curious, how did you choose to be a lay Dominican, and how does that inspire and impact you? I'm curious.
That's a really great question. I started discerning with the Dominicans after we moved here to Michigan about, gosh, it's almost 10 years ago. I can't believe we've been here so long. But in any case, so I have a lot of friends who are Dominicans. I just happened, though, to meet some. I have friends who are Dominican friars, but I had never met any Dominicans who are sisters until I had moved here to Michigan. Mm-hmm. And when I did, I was able to see the charism in its feminine form. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense to me. I mean, I very much admire the friars. It has nothing to do with that, but it was nice to see it, women living it out. And so I went and began discerning with my local chapter of Lay Dominicans. And that process began not long after the birth of my third. I have 5 children and 1 on the way. So I'm fully professed. And it's really great. I mean, the nice thing about the Dominicans is that the vocation dovetails and makes sense as a writer because it's a vocation to the word, both Jesus as the word, and also in the preaching vocation. And for many of us, that takes the form of writing.
Tell us about your novel and where that came from and why that's meaningful, why that's important to you.
Molly Chase series, it's interesting. It in about 2016, 2017, I drafted a story that featured an early version of the character of Molly Chase.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a similar premise to the current one. And the current story, the premise is very simple. Molly's father commits suicide and she discovers the body. It's set in 18th century Boston. So there's a lot of, some interesting historical, viewpoints to bear on just the subject of suicide. And Molly suffers a lot of PTSD flashbacks from this. It's historical romance, which is typically a genre people either love or love to hate, but I love it. But in any case, so I had started an early draft of this several years ago. Interestingly, that version was set 20 years prior to the current setting. It was set in England among her mother's family and not America, and with a completely different cast of characters, right down to the love interest. I mean, completely different book. And so I had written that draft, and I always knew something was off about it. Like the story lacked some sort of essential element, and that I was forcing it in some way. That I was storytelling according to plot structure, which is fine, but that I had neglected character development and, quite frankly, abandoned spontaneity that makes storytelling fun,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it was really kind of interesting. So, meanwhile, the back of my imagination, I had this cast from Boston, and namely the Robb family, and specifically Josiah Robb. And I had the vague idea of him as a merchant sailor. I had the idea of somebody who was sweet on Molly. And he kept saying, "Put me in, coach, put me in, in the back of my mind." And I resisted that for a long time. When you work 2 years on a manuscript, I really was not keen on rewriting the whole thing.
Mm.
I don't know if you've ever had this experience.
Oh, yeah.
Like, really? I don't want to redo it. But eventually I caved. And it was probably one of the best decisions. It was the single best decision I've made with this story, because he just made the whole story come alive, and we see Molly better through his eyes. And so it's a really beautiful thing. So after a few months rewriting, discussing the story with my writing friends, I knew that Molly wasn't going to leave Boston, and I ended up pushing the story setting back. Or forward, actually, from the 1770s to the 1790s. And this is just owing to some research and coming across information about the plight of American merchant sailors during the French Revolutionary Wars. There's just some really interesting circumstances about that, and as Josiah is a sailor, it just clicked. And so I ended up
I'm curious about that. What is it about that particular that time period? What were some of those interesting things that, I remember someone once saying that your what is it, the location of your plot, it should be, you shouldn't be able to take the story and just tell it another time and have nothing, and everything stays exactly the same, because then you've not actually grounded it or tied it to your location and so on. And it sounds like you've done the research into that time period. What was it that captivated you about that?
That's a great question. And I think, as for yourself, as somebody who writes in fantasy, in these kind of speculative genres, you understand the importance of world building. And this is actually where, something like realism, historical realism and spec fiction kind of, they start, this is a point of commonality, which is setting. Basically what had happened was I started researching just the time following the Revolutionary War, and and basically the financial situation of the country, the government, the problems with just the Articles of Confederation and things like this. So lack of governing structure, there was terrible inflation. The British, as soon as the war ended, all these British merchant ships are just waiting right there at the harbor to sell Americans goods, which is really kind of funny, like we just fought the war, and then they just like, oh, by the way, we're back. And And so there was a lot of, there's just a lot of economical issues that.
That sounds like an incredibly tense
It's like
market situation.
Right, right. And so Molly's father is a merchant. So I don't open here, but it provides this wonderful, somebody whose livelihood is, and then there's the personal side, there's the personal life, but then there's also the professional life. And so we have this kind of perfect storm between certain circumstances in their marriage and Molly's parents' marriage and things happening. And then, but also on the business side, what was the piece that I think just triggered it for me, and I think in terms of the imagination, again was this what had happened to American trade during the French Revolutionary War. So basically, the historians estimate that the British Navy impressed, where you take sailors and put them into service. Okay, you tell men you're now part of the British Navy. They did this to the Irish, they did this to their own, they did it to a lot of people, but they did it to Americans. They would stop ships in the middle of the ocean and they would just take part of the crew. They would be like, welcome to the Navy. And historians estimate that that between the start of the French Revolutionary War in 1793 and the War of 1812, something like 10,000 American merchant sailors were pressed into service. And to give you kind of an idea of the numbers, or the how large that number was, the population of Boston in 1793, in the 1790s, was about 18,000 people. Philadelphia was the largest city at 32,000 people. New York had about 28,000 people. So when you say 10,000 merchant sailors were pressed into service, anyway, this just triggered something for me. Wow. It just triggered something about the danger of the high seas. It triggered something about trade. There was an embargo on American trade down in the British West Indies. So just things were very tense. So this just created a kind of a political, economic backdrop that I could place my, personal, very this is, the central character is a woman, and it's mostly mostly a marriage and family drama, but the external circumstances give it a particular kind of flavor. So
yeah, what a fascinating backdrop. So I'm curious then, the character of Molly. Why is she the main character? What is it about her that that makes her the protagonist that carries the whole thing? How did you come up with her? Or did she come first? Was it an event-based story, or is it a person?
She came first. Yeah, okay. She came first. It's interesting. I've been told that Molly's story, well, I say this, Molly and Josiah, like this story doesn't work without Josiah, quite frankly. And I've actually been told I probably could easily name the series Josiah Robb, not just Molly Chase. But the story, actually, Molly's story is actually a Saint Gianna Molla story. And it's what had happened was I started out saying, I'm going to write this courtship story. I've got this situation of a young woman at a time when, suicide and mental health and mental illness is just largely not understood. And in a situation where she's, a little bit of a playing on the damsel in distress trope. And interestingly, and learning how to flip that trope multiple times along the way between who's saving who, and there's this kind of this movement toward forgiving her father and this resolution. Well, I started out this story thinking, I'm writing a nice courtship story, right? You've got this childhood friend, we've got the friends to lovers trope. Oh, isn't that sweet? Like I'm going to write the best one I can, but like that was what I realized. It's a couple things happened. The first one is that I wrote the courtship part, but I didn't solve the father issue. She was still mad at him. And I was like, well, that in a romance, typically any other problems get solved along the way with the courtship. You know, as soon as they propose, you know, as soon as the man proposes, all the problems are resolved in the book. But this is not a problem that is resolvable in that way. That's just life. You know, this is going to be a problem that sticks with her for a long time. So that was problem number one. Problem number two was that I had one of these, this is for storytellers. So I'll just tell you guys, it's fine. I'll confess it. I had this like vision of her death. This is not
of Molly's death.
Of Molly's death, of the end of her life. And it's not until much of a spoiler at this point, because I've said this publicly elsewhere. So anyway, I spent like several days crying about this. I mean, it was very beautiful, you know, but it was very painful. And I was like literally grieving. And my husband's like, "You've lost your marbles. What is wrong with you?" I was like, "I'm grieving. Please stop." He's like, "You realize that she lives in your head."
Yeah.
So I was like,
but that's not, yeah.
My
Characters are
on me in my imagination. Like, you know, death comes from Saul, memento mori, right? So I realized at that moment that I was writing a much bigger story, a much bigger arc than the courtship story.
And that's when it turned into a series?
And that's when it turned into a continuity series.
Okay.
And so at that point, I, you know, it started kind of developing on its own in that way. But yeah, so Molly's story is a very, I mean, in some sense, it's a very, it's 18th century, right? I mean, her home, you know, the home, the domestic sphere is the setting for this story, but it's interestingly driven. A lot of it is driven, and she is driving this sort of, you know, larger world that surrounds her and how it impacts the decisions that they make in their home, and specifically impacts Josiah's work. And so he has a very interesting job offer in the first book, and changes his whole world. So
all right, we'll leave it cryptic there.
Yes.
I want to come back to asking about you know, how you do research, and especially when it comes to grounding the novel in that unique setting, and like how far you go and so on, because especially with historical fiction, the bar is a little higher on how creative you can be. But I'm actually curious, that little vision that you said you had, I'm curious, do you see that actually being a kind of a writer's exercise to take their main character, whether it's a series or just a single novel maybe, and to imagine that last moment and where they end up, whether it's featured in the book or not, and see what that tells you about the character? I'm not sure how to talk about that. What do you think about that? Is that something you'd actually guide people to think about?
I think so. I mean, you've heard this from sources, I'm sure yourself, that people talk about when you tell a story, you really are only telling this, you're only showing the tip of the iceberg, you know, the most salient points that, and when you start, you know, I think in the author's imagination, the characters, there's so much more that you could say about the characters, and you don't, because your readers couldn't handle that fire hose being turned on them, you know?
Right,
Right. And I think there's definitely some worth in putting the imagination to work in imagining the character in different scenarios or different points in their life that they wouldn't necessarily, that, like you say, the story doesn't cut in there. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful exercise. And there are things that I wouldn't show on the page, but I could imagine in a perfectly, like, so for example, so again, this is a marriage, right? Like I can imagine these people making love or having children, and not like in a gross way, but I just simply saying, like, I could see it happening.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I look at like the previous iteration of the story that I had before, the particular character was so underdeveloped and wasn't the right character that's not something that could have even remotely entered into my imagination. That's a problem, it's a genre problem. So just saying, like, I can imagine the characters in these various aspects of their life doing the things that are vocationally appropriate, or whatever. And yeah, again, it's not a gross thing. It's not in a dwelling or
Yeah, no,
not and that's not something I would show in a book.
yeah, and you're right. It's not appropriate for every book, but it's just so intriguing to me, this idea that, I guess it's this one phrase that's coming to mind, which is, how you do anything is how you do everything, right? The sense of attention that you give to an individual action is it's an expression in just a moment of how you usually approach everything else in your life. And I'm just thinking, like, for example, I grew up watching El Cid with Charlton Heston, right? Incredible arc of a life. Are you familiar with the movie?
I'm not.
No. Okay. For those who have never seen that, I have a soft spot for that. It's just this epic medieval Spanish knight. It's all about the battles against the Moors in medieval Spain. And right up to the end, it's all about this incredibly heroic, steadfast character, and his mere presence just catalyzes change in everybody around him. And he's going through his own journey, but he is such a force for conversion and and just guilt and angst all around him. Nobody stays the same coming in contact with this character, and all the way up till the end of his life moment, it's perfectly in keeping with the person he set out to be right from the beginning. I'm thinking of someone like Frodo, and it's like somebody who goes on this incredible journey. How do you wrap up a life like that? And again, fiction is not real life, so fiction is meant to sort of pull away the curtain or dramatize for effect to get you to feel and think a certain way about how to do something. And it's so intriguing to think that if you're creating this character, does it make sense for them to go out quietly and peacefully and loved? And if that's so, and old and so on, if that's so, then that says something about how they're deeply orienting their life to maybe end up there. But if they're perhaps more of a warrior, how are they going to want to try to go out, and how do they actually go out? I don't know. That just intrigues me.
Right, because it would be consistent, I mean,
Exactly.
if it's a building up of the character over time, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think of, as a kind of counterexample, I think of King David in the Bible. As a young man, all these, just his incredible love for God and his great heroism. And then at some point, all the sin sets in, the troubles start, the family issues start, the infighting between his various children and Absalom, and things do get a little bit more complicated, but I think it's, yeah, it is an interesting thing. You say, well, okay, that's real life. What do we do in storytelling? I mean, is storytelling a version of, it's a fictional version of hagiography, in a sense? Is the hero's arc a kind of hagiographic archetype of some sort? I mean, that's a good question. I think in the case of my own book, I would say I am writing a saint, or trying to write a saintly story, and God help me, I hope I can do it. I
And
hope
imagine
so.
doing that, right? Having that intent and then having visualized where you want her to end up.
Can I pull it
I would
off?
imagine that gives you a lot of confidence about, like, how far you can take her afield if you need to, or how much you can then put her through. Because again, you ultimately know where she's going to end up. And so
Right.
then it's a matter of not, let's find out where this is all going, but let's find out how deep she needs to dig, I guess, to deal with her circumstances.
Right. I think it's, what's interesting about this book is that the characters starting out are all Protestants. And Molly's family is Anglican. They go to Old North Church. Josiah's family is Congregationalist. They go to Old South. But at some point, I think in the storytelling process, in terms of going deep, I realized that we needed a Catholic understanding of the afterlife. And because the main antagonist in this story is her father, who is dead. And how do you reconcile with a dead person?
That is so intriguing. The antagonist is dead.
He's the one who set the whole thing in motion. And she has these kind of she has PTSD flashbacks. He lives in memory. He lives in her nightmares. He lives in these unwanted moments that come and take and make it in some sense, Molly just constantly struggling just to have stability, having mental stability, and then there's the inner arc of being able to forgive. So there's the external plot. I've got society drama, and we've got family drama, and we've got this political kind of suspense espionage plot, and then all of this is working. All the circumstances are working toward a very interior one, in which she has to face her father. But again, how do you do this if you don't have the Catholic imagination behind it? And I think part of it is just like, in my head, I was like, there's going to be a conversion in the story. I don't like writing. I don't like conversion stories generally. Like, I very rarely do I think they succeed. I'm one of those rare people who thinks the Charles Ryder's conversion at the end of Brideshead Revisited is like a complete flop.
I've never actually read that or even seen the movie.
Well, Julia Fly in Brideshead, that makes perfect sense to me. That she goes back to the church, perfect sense. Follows from the plot, the action of the plot, from the character development of the arc of the story. Charles Ryder, it's off stage, it's years later. Red Sanctuary Lamp, I know, but like this doesn't make any sense to me. But maybe someday I'll figure it out. But conversion stories I think are really hard to write. They're hard to write without slipping into pontificating or slipping into apologetics. But at the same time, it's an interesting time in Boston in the 1790s, following the Bill of Rights, the passage of the Bill of Rights, and Massachusetts changed its constitution to allow for the free practice of religion, and all of a sudden you have the Catholics are actually able to practice openly. There was a parish. I have all the information on that, all the research information, and the name of the priest. He becomes a character in my story, and there's just a lot of wonderful historical things that I get to work into that. But Massachusetts and Boston in particular was just a really interesting time religiously. There's a lot going on. The Unitarians are also on the rise, so there's just people are just in flux religiously at that time. So it works. The conversion works. It's just not what I was planning on.
That's so intriguing.
But the imagination demanded it. The story demanded it. I couldn't leave her without some sort of understanding of purgatory.
Like I said, I want to ask you
on right now. This doesn't quite feature into the book that you could actually buy. Right now, this is the muddy middle of the book, where I am currently trying to rewrite a bunch of material to, get it back to my editor. So
that's amazing. The question I wanted to ask has just slipped my mind, but I do want to come back and ask you about again the research, because you've just listed off a bunch of little things, and I'm curious how you navigate that. And then the other question I did want to also ask was, as somebody who is writing, as you're working through this process and you're finding all of this, this research and stuff that's interesting you, do you do you bring your audience along with you? Like, do you share any of that progress, or are you more the kind of author where you kind of retreat into great silence and great distance and just work on gestating this thing and then sort of release it, or do you involve your fans,
That's a great
with the journey?
question. For the first book, I was definitely in monastic mode. Um, and then at some point I came out of that about a year before I was, about a year before, about a year and a half before I had actually had the books acquired. Um, the I do post. I mean, I will share things on social media. I like talking about the process of the book and the process of writing, and sharing historical links and just links to articles and that sort of thing. I will do that. In terms of juggling the research, I think. I mean, here's the good question: how is it that Tolkien like knew as much as he did about his little world?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to the point of developing languages for it, to the point of developing an entire world, history and, metaphysical history and God knows what else, I mean, it's like, because he loved it. And so I think, I love history. I love this time period. This is definitely, um, this is definitely, this definitely my time period. And um, so basically, I what I will do is I will read a couple of kind of just general books. I'll get the layout of the land. I will read biographies.
Mm-hmm.
That's always helpful. Um, so for this one, I read Ron Chernow's Hamilton. I also watched the musical, so now I know, the real deal. Just kidding. There's a lot of fiction in that one too. um, but um, so I'll read some biographies just to kind of get a sense of the time period. I will read some source material, and this one had some really interesting ones. There's a lot of interesting detours on this one. So first of all, Molly has one of her skills is what's called mantua making, or we call dressmaking. The old-fashioned term is mantua making, and so I read up on not only on the fashion of the period, but I also read up on. I have a book that is, the guide to 18th century dressmaking, and it gives instructions on how to
Oh,
hand sew
wow.
all this stuff. I mean, to the point of like, oh, here are the little stitches that you can do. I'm not a seamstress, um, but it's to like able to in my head know, okay, this is what she's doing when she's constructing, like
Mm-hmm.
physically, I mean, if she has somebody in front of her, what is she doing with her hands? How is she fitting this to the person? All those little steps, those little minutia, those details make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Josiah is a sailor. I can't sail. I can't even be on a ship without. I can't be on a boat without losing my insides.
Cool. Yeah.
Right. I get really terribly seasick. I love the water. I get horribly sick. And but I'm like, well, what can I show? And and I mean, the internet's amazing. I just look and say, okay, well, what is it that I can show? I'm not going to show navigation. That's a skill beyond my ability to learn it at
Mm-hmm.
this time. But what can I show? I can set up this scene in such a way that, you know, he's sitting on the main top and then he comes down off the main top. Okay, so he's sitting on the main top and then he sees something out in the water. Okay, and he comes down off the main top and, talk to the captain. Like, that's something I can actually describe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so look up online. How do you climb up and down the mast? And just describing it, like looking and saying, like, this is how I can describe it. Putting things in their political context is a lot easier. In that particular scene I'm thinking about, this is from the first book. He spies, what he sees from the main top is, well, he's up on the main top thinking about something else entirely, but he sees a British triple decker, out in the water, and he can't quite see it, so he calls to the captain. Captain gets out his glass and takes a look. Okay, so that's setting it into its political context. and then the chapter goes from there. They get to Charleston, and Citizen Genet shows up, and I just happen to time it all perfectly so that, you know, we just land right in the middle of a political crisis. It's great. That's how I like things, because I could do that. I could put my fictional characters, in the middle of these things. I actually dropped Josiah in the middle of a cabinet meeting when he's, you know, with all the biggies, you know, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
What is that quote? It's like, our job as authors is to put our characters up trees and then throw rocks at them.
That's right.
Yeah. Have you seen, while writing these books, have you enjoyed any particular like movies or series, perhaps in that time period, that as you watched them, you thought, that's, you know.
That's it. Yeah. The Horatio Hornblower series.
I love that series.
It's so good. Yes. Yeah. So that one, I definitely, we had watched, we've owned it for years and years, but we hit, my husband Jared and I were somewhere in the drafting process. We made a point of going through the whole series again. Yeah. Just to get a good flavor for it. I mean, of course, it's on the wrong side, even so that's the British, but that's okay.
We grew up watching that.
We had to turn on the closed captioning though, so that we could actually get all of the nautical terms. You know,
right.
You know, right. For example, you know, I mean, we don't, you know, contemporary nautical term for like something like port versus starboard. Well, you know, then it wasn't port, it was larboard. You know, so they have a different term for it, things like that.
Gotcha. Do you have, growing up, did you have a favorite legend or a favorite story that really impacted you, that, I don't know, you keep coming back to, or you draw on, or was inspiring to you?
You know, as a kid, oh my goodness.
Or even growing up, is there one that really stands out to you?
I was gonna say, as a child, I think it was just deprived, because I'm pretty sure I spent most of my time reading The Babysitter's Club.
Okay. I never grew up with that, actually. Well, I grew up in Australia. I don't think that they had that down there.
You're fortunate. Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, I feel so jealous. I'm so envious of, you know, these kids whose parents know. Yeah. So my parents, growing up, my parents definitely encouraged my reading. I remember as a very young, so this is the 80s, the early 80s. I remember my mom had signed me up for the Weekly Readers Book Club. And, you know, every week I would get a picture book in the mail, you know, and it was a big deal, you know, it was and I was reading at age 4. So my parents were very, very much encouraging of my reading, and they always took us to the library. And, but I also think that they didn't have a whole lot of input in terms of like what I was reading. I think they largely left that to me to pick, which is just what happened. You know, it's not a judgment. It's just the way it was. So I did read a lot of Babysitter's Club, but I also I think that probably the most formative of my reading as a girl was the Little House books, Little House in the Prairie.
Sorry, which one?
The Little House books.
Okay.
Yeah, Little House in the Prairie and all of the rest. There was a period of time, I think this is pretty common in middle school, where I didn't read a lot. And then at some point I started reading, I think, YA historical fiction. And then at some point in high school, somebody introduced me to Jane Austen. And that was my first foray into grown-up literature. And it was also my introduction into the great books. I did go to a great books college and had a wonderful, wonderful education. And so I have read the canon, but I think the children's classics are something I've read as mostly have read them as an adult, and not a kid.
Yeah, I think I remember getting from secondhand bookstore the first book by Laura Ingalls, The Little House on the Prairie, and I loved that, and I would reread that over and over. That and Little Women and Treasure Island. Always rereading those. I remember those as a kid; they were staples.
Yeah.
That's great. I can see now how there's the arc of your own development in reading those and then, centering or coming down to writing these particular stories?
It's interesting. I will say this. Yes, my imagination is very much formed by, I think, historical settings. And like I said, I do love history. I think the interesting thing, just to come back to your question, lately as an adult, I've been thinking a lot about just the story of the Garden of Eden. I recently read Ratzinger's Daughter Zion. It's the second time I've read that book, and I was thinking there's some passages in Daughter Zion that had that illuminated some things around the relationship of men to and women to each other, and then the relationship to God. So right, there's a kind of a triangulation of we're made in the image and likeness of God, but then there's masculinity and femininity, and just thinking about the interrelatedness of that and how we have self-knowledge in that kind of triumvirate. And I was thinking about it in relation to love story genre conventions. Like, why does this resonate? Why are we here? Why is it that the love story is so popular as a genre? Why is it that people gravitate toward it? Even genres that don't necessarily aren't love stories, so things like action, thrillers, there's very oftentimes a love story as a subplot. I just circling back to something like Hamilton the musical, right? The main conflict of that story is Hamilton's ambition.
Okay.
That's the main plot, is his ambition, but the subplot is the marriage story of his story with Eliza, and it's the marriage story that changes the arc of the main story. So his ambition shifts, specifically after the death of their son, their oldest, which is in fact, they had a number of children. I don't remember how many the Hamiltons had, but the eldest did die in a duel defending his father, and it just shattered them. He left politics. And so, yeah, it definitely shifts the story. And so it's a very interesting one, where you say like the love story has this, has a really preeminent place in literature and storytelling. Hamilton's not literature, but it's storytelling. It has, from the beginning of time, we are interested in this relationship, and there's a brokenness that we see in the Garden of Eden that just kind of gets played out again and again and again, because we're always looking for understanding, and we're looking for that wholeness. And much of that comes through an understanding of our relationship to each other, and through the healing of a kind of theology of the body, marital.
Yeah.
These dimensions are very interesting to me as a storyteller. So, yeah.
No, I think that's beautiful.
There. I'm married to a theologian. I don't know if that's obvious or not.
For those who are, if you're watching and enjoying this, go ahead and hit like, because that was a cool point right there. And I think it's so funny for me. I'm just thinking back on the number of real love stories in ancient cultures and the myths. I can't remember very many of them coming from that theological level. They're almost always very much on a human level. And it's almost like people recognizing that there is a human reality of deep love and passion and relationship that is not being reflected by their religions or by their theologies. And it's like the two are in conflict until something like the God of the Hebrews, arrives and provides clarity. And then all of a sudden, love is grounded back in God himself, and is not something that is just sort of like a battle that we have that fights against this dehumanizing, the pantheons where they're not actually in love, and it's always battles and politics. But then, people are the ones who make the Trojan War happen, right? And it wasn't. I don't know. I think that's intriguing, that coming back to love being the core motivator.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it really is. I mean, almost all stories, it's a love of something. I think the love between humans, the love between people is such a, it is, what are we grasping at? I mean, if I think, I mean, in the Old Testament, right? I mean, it's probably, if we look at the Old Testament, we have, God is not gendered. I mean, strictly, he's not. But we see the relationship. We see spousal relationship or imagery used, especially in Hosea, and in Ezekiel comes back to it, right? So it's and the personification of wisdom in the wisdom books, personification of wisdom as female, and but this is in contrast with the pagan pantheon where the gods are male and female specifically, and so it's interesting. Just this is a subject far beyond my ken, but it's just that what is the spousal relationship? What is it doing? And how is it subsumed upward? There's the very human side of it, which is passion and love. And, I mean, I have in my first book, in Pieces, the first of the Molly Chase series, one of the topics is thinking through the dynamics of courtship. But just even at some point, there's always, in every romance, there's always a breakup scene. This is part of the romance genre convention. It's important. You have to have a breakup scene of some sort, right? There's always a breakup scene. So I have my breakup scene, right? And in the middle of the argument, Josiah, Molly is clueless, and Josiah is a man very deeply in love. And he just, in the narrative, just in his head, it's like he didn't want to be friends. He wants to be lovers, like husband and wife, like she the mother, he the father, like have kids, like and there's this moment of like, she just does not understand me at all. And that there's a very kind of and in particular masculine passion for that kind of erotic, that kind of erotic love, as much as it is the unitive and the agape love as well. So I mean, it's and they already have philos, right? They already have philos. They already have friendship love, but this and that is part of the human experience, but what is it that is about our faith and about these deeper questions of how is it that how is this elevated into God himself? These are very interesting questions. We could go on for hours about this one.
I think so too. I mean, we do need to start wrapping up. I want to throw a little caveat on what I just said earlier about different ancient stories and myths and so on, because I'm thinking about I think the only culture that actually did close that gap between, I guess, like agape and the Godhead or the divinities would be the Indian culture, which is so unbelievably ancient. Out of India, they have some phenomenal love stories up at the
and sort of
the gods level. Yeah,
you tell me. This sounds really interesting.
For those who know their mythology better than I do, I just want to do a hat tip. Mostly, I'm talking about Western mythology, where there's more of that divide, and then Sinai, Tabor starts to re-bridge, theosis, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, starting to wrap up here, I want to ask you in a minute to share your message of encouragement to Catholic authors. But first, for those who are watching, if you're listening to this on Spotify, please go ahead, like this. It helps more people to, get these kinds of interviews and be inspired by them. This is the kind of thing that we're doing with the community we're building in Catholic Author. It's a super friendly, creative community for the modern Catholic author. It's a way for you to give and get feedback, share your insights and your works in progress, build a network of supportive friends, and then plus a whole lot more. So come and check us out at CatholicAuthor.us. So Rhonda, in wrapping up, if you had 1 minute to share a message of encouragement to other authors, writing Catholic inspired fiction or just simply writing, fiction, what would you want to say?
Well, I want to come from a viewpoint of, I have, like as I said, 5 children and one on the way. And my quiet time is at a real premium. I don't have much time to stare at the blank page, much less, um, you know, just wasting it. So I do make a point of pounding the keyboard regardless, even if I end up throwing it out later. And I just want to encourage people to say that, yeah, your circumstances may look impossible. And we have a busy home. I know how that goes. I know how hard it is to fight for that time. But, just thank God every day for encouraging spouses and the help that I receive from the outside and from friends. And just knowing that, that our friends can make this possible. So if you've been given the gift of a story, it's a gift from God, and God's going to make it possible for you. And it is worth every minute that you have to make it happen. So definitely keep writing.
I think that's a perfect place to end. Thanks again, Rhonda. Thanks for who's watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And yes, keep writing.
Thank you.